Welcome back to Own Another Thing. It's been a crazy week. We had a long weekend. President said that he felt like he's been treated worse than, again, Abraham Lincoln.
From the penny.
From the penny. Also famous for being shot at a theater while president. So you can argue who was treated worse, and we'll get down to that later on in the podcast. Again, thank you for joining us. You can check us out anywhere news is found. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, we're everywhere. Thank you for joining us. So the latest on the coronavirus, I know that's why most of you are probably here today to come hear from these two doctors about the coronavirus. And I say that as a joke because we are not doctors. We are far from them. Anyway.
Bert's probably the closest to being a doctor.
Bert is probably the closest to being a doctor. Listen to me stumble through a basic word. Anyway. So, as we just stated, the president went on Fox News over the weekend. Was that Saturday or Sunday night? Saturday night, the president went on Fox News, and I don't know what to describe it as, but wow, what an evening of news, and what an evening of quotables. I can't imagine if, let's not even say Obama. I know we always like to, whenever we talk about the imagine ifs in politics today, we say, imagine if Obama had done that. Imagine if Obama had done this. And we're going to go back to this today because I think it's counterproductive to always use the Obama administration to be the contrast to the Trump administration because it is so obvious. And it is so obvious that people that are going to get more upset whenever we talk about something Donald Trump did and what Barack Obama did. Those two sides are so split that it doesn't really help to compare the two whenever there's a reaction to something or when one of them does something. Because obviously Fox News is always going to pile on Barack Obama anytime he did anything. And they're not going to do it to President Trump when he does something. So it's not really worth us talking about that. But imagine if, after 9/11, George W. Bush walked out in front of millions of people, had a sit-down interview on Fox News, and went through a list of people that he blames and holds more accountable than himself for 9/11. And it wasn't even Bush's fault that 9/11 happened. I know, hot take here on the pod, I know. But imagine if Bush went on Fox News, went on CNN, went on CBS, like halfway through the 9/11 response, or in the early goings-on of post-9/11 America, and said, yeah, you know what? I am really going up against the tough media here. I mean, the world stage clearly hates the United States of America, so what am I supposed to do with that? My dad was president before. I didn't really hang around for any of that. Jeb really got to see more of that. Like, imagine if Bush went on TV and did that. The amount of... I don't even know, would there be outrage for that? Do you think people would be upset back then if Bush went on TV and did that?
I think there would be, because if you look, we've looked at this before, his approval rating right after 9/11 was really good, and that's because of how empathetic he was, and because of the response he had to it, and I think were he to have the opposite response, his approval rating probably would be more reflective of what Trump is right now.
And then that brings us to another one of Trump's major criticisms of what's happening to him now, which is that the media doesn't treat him fairly, when what is there to treat him fairly on at this point? Which is a question that I don't think that his own supporters even feel comfortable asking themselves. Is what has he done to this point that gives him a right to good, fair coverage that isn't constantly pointing out his shortcomings?
He just wants softball questions. That's all he wants.
He just wants softballs?
Yeah, he just wants softball questions to make him look good for his campaign. And that's not going to happen.
That's not what he's going to get, because that's what these briefings started out as,
yeah.
as a way for him to have these rallies. Then they went from that very quickly as the death toll rose. So he went on Fox News. We'll digress from that for now. He went on Fox News, had this whole sit-down interview with Bret Baier, if you don't know which one of the Fox News idiots he is, he's the one that if you take Little Bear, you remember the Nick Jr. show Little Bear. So if you take Little Bear and you put Dwight Schrute's face over that, but it's Dwight Schrute's face with that like CPR mask over it, and it has like
I know exactly who you're talking about.
Slightly human features, and it's kind of like a square head. But that's which one Brett Baer is, and he's the one who does these sit down interviews, and he's the one who he always has the people on. He has his show, and he was actually critical of the president a couple months ago during impeachment. He took a slight swipe at the president, and I wasn't sure if they'd ever recover, but clearly they have, because Brett Baer allowed the president to go on after blaming China, after blaming the Obama administration, after blaming the CDC, the World Health Organization, after blaming Dr. Fauci, who this week even came out on CNN last night and said that we should start asking states how many deaths are apparently acceptable to them, since everybody wants to open so early, but we'll talk about that a little bit more going on. He went through all of this, and then Brett Baer didn't stop him there. And Brett Baer definitely didn't stop him after he said that he had been treated worse than President Lincoln. And I think that there is a definite set of people that will hear Trump say that off Fox News and say, you know what? Yeah, he has been treated worse than Lincoln. Lincoln didn't have to go up against that Alcindor lady. That goddamn Alcindor woman. He just had to go up against John Wilkes Booth. Which is incredible to think that he even feels that he has the ground to say that a president who was shot dead on an off day, technically, has had it worse than President Trump, who doesn't get a day off in office, obviously. Whenever you can tell, all he wants is to go play golf.
The poor guy.
The poor guy. He went to Camp David and he couldn't even take a moment for himself. Poor man.
Also really unfair to compare yourself to a president that literally existed in a different century when the media was completely different.
Different century, and let's not forget, not only was the media totally different in that there was probably, and I don't know this for a fact because I don't know enough about the media landscape at the time, maybe 3 or 4 newspapers.
Yeah.
In D.C., they could get news out quickly and it had to spread from there, I'm assuming via Pony Express or via wire or whatever. Because there was no radio at the time either, so there wasn't really a wire service either. So, totally different time to be president, and totally different issue that he got shot over. Do not forget that Lincoln got shot because he freed the slaves, and John Wilkes Booth was not too thrilled with that. Actually, John Wilkes Booth was a very interesting character. Wasn't John Wilkes Booth a disenfranchised actor?
I don't know.
I forget. There's an interesting characteristic about him that they talk about a lot. But anyway, we'll digress from there because there's a lot to talk about today, and comparing Trump to Lincoln is not something we want to do. So, where should we dive in at here? I guess just on the headlines. The Treasury Department is planning to borrow $3 trillion over 3 months. That's more than double the total it borrowed last year as the government tries to stave off an economic collapse. Always good news to hear economic collapse brought up on a news and politics podcast. And I don't know where the $3 trillion comes from. I don't know who they borrow that from.
What does borrow mean?
Do they borrow that
who?
from the Fed? Do they borrow that from China? Who do they borrow that from? I'm just reading it off the Post headlines here.
Trump is always bragging about how he's finally getting China to pay for things or to give them money, so maybe, I don't know.
I don't know. But anyway, aside from that, and this is what I'm really excited to talk about today, Americans clearly oppose the reopening of restaurants, retail stores, and other businesses, even as more states begin to ease their coronavirus restrictions, according to a survey done by the Washington Post and University of Pittsburgh ACC arch rival, University of Maryland. Couldn't go without saying. I'm sorry. I was going to talk about how rivalries don't matter in college sports anymore because of the realignment that caused Pitt to be a rival with Maryland, but it makes no sense because Pittsburgh and Maryland are not that close, really. We're just in the same line, but again, I digress because we're not here to discuss local, I guess not local, but geography. Anyway, I digress. So the polling shows that despite many states feeling like it's okay to open and that their citizens want to open, most people do not want that to happen. The polling right now shows that 67% of folks wouldn't feel safe shopping at a retail store right now. So that means I wouldn't go to a Marshall's right now. I specifically wouldn't go to that Marshall's down by Northern Boulevard that's in our neighborhood.
Ugh.
I don't want to give away too much of where we're at, but there's a Marshalls close to us that turns into a war zone. And I think that's how a lot of Marshalls in the city turn into, because there's so many of us and there's so many good deals at a Marshalls. I digress. I wouldn't feel safe going there, and 67% of Americans wouldn't feel safe going there. Would you?
Nope.
Okay. 78% wouldn't feel comfortable eating out at a sit-down restaurant right now. And what that really means, and it might be more important for the media to start saying things like this whenever they report polling, is that only 22% of people would actually feel safe in a restaurant right now. That's obviously less than half the population. That's even less than a quarter of the population of the polled people would feel safe even at a restaurant right now. So even going. And then only 33% of people would also want to go and fight a crowd at a Marshalls along with us. So the larger portion of people do not want things to be reopening, and we'll see in 2 weeks whether we can reopen in the way that we've reopened or not, or whether that's going to become something that we start calling a southern thing, which is fast rises in coronavirus rates in the states that are opening faster, like Georgia and Florida, and who else is opening too early? Georgia, Florida, those are the two big ones. I think Tennessee has announced some, Arizona has announced some. A lot of places are announcing that they're at least easing restrictions, despite what Fauci said last night on CNN, saying that that's going to come at a big cost of lives, and it just depends how comfortable they are. Yeah, that's true. They've already seen the highest.
They had something like they reopened, and they said like they had 1,000 new cases within like the first few days of reopening, which was a huge spike for them. So clearly we've already seen the negative effects of it.
Negative effects of it. And it shows the negative effects whenever you listen to really small fractions of people and treat them as if they are a larger voice. Because now we're run into a situation where, do you remember whenever we used to like ostracize people for being crazy or having like one manic fit? And it's good that you're here right now because we're going to talk about Britney Spears.
I saw that you had Britney Spears.
We have Britney Spears.
I was already ready to fiercely defend her.
Okay, so in 2007? Britney Spears went absolutely insane.
She had a mental breakdown. I don't think she.
I was going to say that. Okay. You're right. She had a mental breakdown. Go ahead. She had a mental breakdown.
She shaved her head. There's an iconic photo of her with a shaved head behind a vehicle. It's not a good photo.
Not a good photo. Not a good way to be seen.
And people called her crazy.
And you'll remember we didn't hear from Britney Spears for what? 7 years after that, at least. When did she start making music and being around again?
She definitely disappeared for a couple.
She disappeared for a while, and we called her crazy, and people didn't listen to her. We did the same thing with like Lindsay Lohan when she went crazy. Well, she did a bunch of drugs, I guess, too. I digress. There's a difference between Britney Spears going crazy and the crazy that we're seeing at state capitals and at these anti-distancing protests, because Britney Spears, lifetime of pressure, lifetime of having to be like the star, lifetime of having to be like America's girl, so to speak, America's sweetheart, so to speak. Mounting pressures her entire life, lead her to crack, have a mental breakdown in 2007, be like publicly shunned for a few years, let back in once we forgave her for nothing that was her own fault again. But then we're going to go and we're going to report on people choosing to belligerently scream at police officers, take literal military-style weapons to state houses, dress like they're going to fight in the middle of... They're not even dressed like they're going to fight anywhere, but dress as if they could go fight somewhere in a war, in a hastily put-together militia. And no one is saying to them, we are saying, a lot of us are saying they're crazy, but they still get listened to. And they're still getting treated as if they are a group of people that have a platform to say anything. And that's so dangerous because you let people that, again, just years ago, and I don't know if this just speaks to our new age where we have to let everybody have an equal say in everything, but I don't blame it on that. I blame it more on the media being scared to be called unbiased. But to take someone having a mental breakdown, totally throw them to the side, cast them out from society for something that wasn't their own fault, and then allow these people to choose to act like literal maniacs, literal gun-toting maniacs who we have seen commit mass shootings, go out and commit terror attacks, shoot up nightclubs, shoot up shopping centers. Allow them to choose to do something that we have called crazy before, arm themselves with automatic rifles, something that we have all categorized as a crazy thing to do. We allow them to do that and allow them to have a voice and speak on television and act as if what they're doing is okay. And by doing that, it makes it seem like it's okay.
You know why, though? I think it's because their behavior is fueled by anger and it's fueled by hate. So people feel like they have a reason to be angry. That's why they're acting like that. It's because they're upset. It's because of this happened.
But they don't.
And they don't. No,
they
absolutely.
don't. Yeah.
But I'm saying I think that's why they give them a voice, because they're like, oh, these people are upset about something. Whereas with Britney, she's upset about her whole life.
Yeah.
You know, that's why it was easy to cast her to the side, because they're like, oh, that's a personal thing. But, you know, with these people, it's like, oh, well, they're upset. They're not being treated fairly.
I know it's not entirely the same, but like with Britney and these protesters, obviously that's why we talked about it. These people are, again, choosing to act like this. And I think the issue is that they think it's okay for them. And it's the same thing. I used to say this about the mass shootings, and I still think it's true, too, that covering them can lead to, like, copycats. I know it's not so often anymore, but when it was more, like, just school shootings, I think people just kept doing them at a point. I know it's been debunked to a point, but I still think there is something to that.
I think there's something to that with protests, for sure. It only takes one person to start a movement with protests.
Exactly. And then we're seeing that these people don't represent a large enough portion, I think.
Yeah, clearly from those statistics.
From those statistics to even give them a voice, because by giving them the amount of voice that we have already given them, by giving them this much coverage, by saying, look what these people are doing, look what they stand for, it almost makes it seem like there is some validity to it, and that they've chosen the right thing to be outraged about this time, because that is something that these people that are out doing these protests and storming these state capitals and holding these state capitals hostage for small periods of times before, of course, they are shooed out by police and said, no, we're closing, so you guys have to go home, and then they go home. What they're doing is they're doing their selective outrage bit that they always do, where they pick what part of an issue makes them mad so that they can play victim and seem as if, oh, well, look what the establishment is doing to us now. But it's going to a very violent and dangerous place now, I think. We tried not to talk about them too much on here. We talked about these people a few weeks ago whenever they had just started, whenever they were in Colorado with the bad signs. But now it's gone to a place where it's, like, actually dangerous. I think it's very important for the media to, like, just forget about playing both sides now, because I know that they have to be fearful of, like, being called biased. I know one of the things they worry about most is that someone's going to say, oh, well, you guys are biased, we can't trust your coverage. Then once that starts, people stop tuning in. But anymore, that's just how news goes, I feel like. And I know that's not fair, but it doesn't matter how you report something. It's like, not to quote Pete Buttigieg too much on the podcast here, but it's like whenever they say anything a Democrat does is going to get called socialist. Anything anyone in the media does now is going to get called biased. So why not put the same side's argument to the side for this? Because of how dangerous it is. Because we know that these people being out and these people protesting, not only do they look insane, not only are they saying things that are totally wrong, totally inaccurate, moving those theories forward, they're also putting lives at risk every time they go out, because we know how contagious this thing is. If even one of these protesters has it, they infect their small bunch, which, don't forget, this is not a lot of people at these rallies. They keep saying hundreds. Hundreds is not that many, but hundreds can cause thousands of problems when there is a pandemic going around.
Well, we saw that happen. There was just something that came out today in Huntington Beach, California, where all of those huge protests were happening.
Crazy.
Their increase in new cases has skyrocketed since those protests happened. So they have achieved exactly what they set out to do, I guess. Like, they just proved our point that it was more dangerous than it was worth doing.
Yeah.
Now they have, like, a bigger outbreak than had to be.
And now there's
It was something like a 22%.
Yeah, because that's how the
increase.
cases were going up in California. Is that what they're attributing it to?
They have been able to narrow it down. It's exactly in that area where they were protesting has increased in cases by 22%.
See, they're choosing the wrong thing to be outraged about.
They're just proving a point.
They're proving a point.
What we're doing is exactly right. And every time they break protocol and no longer distance, they're just showing that it has negative, harmful effects. And they're the ones getting sick.
And they're the ones getting sick now. But every time they do it, they risk lives. And that's what Dr. Birx was even saying. Mm-hmm. And I think this also goes to show the Blue Lives Matter fallacy.
Yeah.
And then I was excited to talk about this today. I was excited for this today because I think that's the glaring point of all of this, and why these people get to act like this is because it's white rage. White rage gets so much more validity. It's covered in a more, you can trust this rage, these people are right to be outraged, than any other person's outrage, than any other group of people's outrage. So we see these videos start coming out of people literally berating police officers, yelling and screaming at police officers, waving signs in their face, charging up to police officers like full speed, having to be grabbed by their protest buddies or whatever they're calling themselves.
Literally the opposite of a peaceful protest.
Literally the opposite of a peaceful protest. And one, they're allowed to do this. Not one shot's fired, not one person is detained, not one person's neck is stepped on. But these are the very same people who, anytime a Black Lives Matter protest happens, they whip out their fucking flag with a stupid blue stripe on it and start screaming about how, well, the cops are just protecting themselves, you know? Their lives matter too. They got families to get home to. Where is that now? Why doesn't that matter now? And it's because I reckon, and I don't think this is true for everybody. I don't think this is true for all Blue Lives Matter folk. But to an extent, a lot of those people are just happy to see a white person beating up on a black person. And they see it as something that should be allowed because one of them wears a uniform and one of them is a black person. And that's what it comes down to, I think. Mm-hmm. There's nothing more to it, and they've proven that. They've proven that time and again, and now they've proven that the core point of their message is that they're better than everybody because of who they are.
Yeah.
I think.
No, absolutely. I mean, people have been bringing up, like, with these videos that were surfacing over the weekend of these protesters, people are saying, imagine Ferguson. Imagine if this were happening at Ferguson. It's like, we saw the violence that happened when they tried to hold a peaceful protest. And that's why I pointed out that this has been the opposite of a peaceful protest. And I honestly don't think police officers should ever be violent. Like, I think we should always find a way to try to dismantle things in a way that nobody gets hurt. But the fact that we can compare these protests, which were not peaceful, to protests in places like Ferguson and Charlottesville, which were intended to be peaceful protests, and we saw the amount of violence and the amount of lives lost, and the amount of people that got hurt.
Violence caused by police officers and counter-protesters.
And it just makes it so clear that it's a race problem.
Yeah.
It's not, like you said, Blue Lives Matter only when it's convenient for them.
The blue lives never mattered. The stay at home doesn't matter. It's that you don't get to go out and live your perfectly unchecked, let me be unchained white existence.
Did you see that horrifying image of that one protester who literally built a cage around himself and called it, like, his quarantine cage?
Crazy.
And I was like, are you kidding me? There are children in cages.
They have their swastikas and the sign that was the literal entranceway to Auschwitz. They took the actual text from the arch and put it on a sign. Like, these people are so obviously callous. They're so obvious in what they want to be a reality that they go out of their way to prove it every day. And that's another reason why we shouldn't give these people a microphone. We shouldn't treat these 20% of people that for some reason want to go sit down inside of an Applebee's or they want to go to Ruby Tuesdays for the evening or whatever the fuck it is these 20% of people want to do. They have shown to have really no actual moral opinion, no actual stance on anything, because they don't get outraged until it starts affecting them. They don't get mad at police officers until police officers are enforcing laws and policies that keep them from going out and doing something, or that keep them from just a basic thing. If a police officer stops them and says, "Hey, why are you going out?" and they say, "We're doing this," and the police officer, okay, digress. I'm getting off track here. There was a story a couple weeks ago about a police officer who arrested a father who was outside playing catch with his son in the front yard. He arrested him, and Miranda righted him, and put him in the backseat of the car. And everybody on the right got so mad about that because it was just a father playing with his son. And I was so mad because even my mom called me, and I think you were around. Well, you were definitely around because we lived together.
Can you just clarify? Was he at his home or is he in a public place?
I think it was at his home. I'm not sure, but
because that is important.
It is important.
I think he was in a public park because I saw that too. There was one with a mom playing with her son too, and it was in a public park.
Even so, there's handfuls to dozens to hundreds to thousands of stories, I'm sure, of police officers going into people's front yards of black family homes and arresting fathers violently, throwing them on the ground and cuffing them, beating them, dragging them through the mud in front of their kids. There's videos of it. There's evidence of it, and we see it on a monthly basis at times. But every single time it happens, these people that say, well, how could he arrest that guy who's just playing with his son? There's no outrage for that black father. There is not 1 ounce of outrage for that family that had to see their father, see their husband get dragged through the mud and beat viciously. Whether it's in a public place or in their own front yard. It happens routinely. And that's why I didn't think it mattered where it happened. I don't think it matters that it happened in a public place. I don't think it mattered that it happened in the person's front yard. These police officers are just doing their duty, don't forget. They're just doing their duty every time they kill a black person. They're just doing their duty. But now, they're just doing their duty, and these people are finally freaked out. Suddenly, they're the oppressed people. And I don't think, obviously, they don't care about anything but themselves, so why listen to them whenever there's a greater good scenario unfolding in front of us? Because the more we give them a microphone, the more governors and senators and people say, well, these people are mad, we have to make changes for them, and then we end up doing what the silent majority wants to do again, and we end up with years and years of problems because we're listening to the small, uneducated group of people who don't actually know what they're talking about. And we do it for everything. And I'm tired of it happening. That's why I don't know. That's why we talked about it today. It just keeps happening.
Arrest them all. Just put them all under arrest. Are they breaking the law? Yes, great. They're all arrested. Just dismantle the protest. I don't understand why
just break it up.
Allow it to happen.
Just break it up. They would break it up for anybody else.
The laws have been passed. You cannot be out. You can't be out. You have to be home. You have to be socially distancing. If they break those laws, don't be violent. Of course, don't be violent, but arrest them. Put them under arrest.
Put them under arrest. Because that's what they would do for literally anybody else.
Exactly. No, it's so frustrating. And that's why I agree with you. I don't think they should be showing it anymore. Because I can't even, this is coming from me, but I can't imagine being somebody who has, witnessed people die at Ferguson, or even just being a black person in America and having to see this on the news constantly. I feel outraged, so I can't even fathom how outraged they must feel to just see this blatant display of clearly racial bias, and that's why the police are not hurting them and not arresting them. Just take it off the news. It does so much more harm than good.
And it's the scope that it's covered through. It's this fairness that it's given, and it doesn't deserve that fairness because they don't give it to anybody else. Which leads us to the next thing. There a story leaked this weekend with some projections for the hashtag coronavirus. Hashtag coronavirus that showed.
Leak? What do you mean?
It just got out. How things leak.
It wasn't supposed to be out?
I don't think it was supposed to be out because then. Up until literally 20 minutes ago when we started recording, the White House and the CDC said that the numbers in this report were not true, but now they're saying they are true.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Because they got caught.
Because they got caught. So this report came out this weekend showing that 100 to even 240,000 Americans may still die, and we may still end up with 100,000 Americans. Did I say that right? Yeah, 100,000 Americans dead by June 1st, and we may have 3,000 people a day dying by June 1st. Again, dying first, with possibly 3,000 Americans dying a day also by that date, which for those of you keeping track at home, depending what metric you're using, that is one 9/11 a day, essentially, every day until June 1st, where we might peak and plateau and start coming down in the deaths. That came out this weekend, and then was somewhat backed up by the president during his, again, crazy interview on Fox News, where he said that 80, 90, maybe 100,000 people might die. He was playing like this Price is Right, kind of like, the game on the Price is Right, where the mountain climber game?
No, I didn't watch that.
Price is Right mountain climber game. So it keeps going up and you get the money it goes with. But he was kind of doing that with the deaths. Anyway, not to be too dark. So he said that, and then they started asking the White House and the CDC about these reports, and they started denying that these reports had anything to do with them.
Where did the reports come from?
They were just leaked to the press. That's the thing. They're not sure.
Okay.
But the kicker here is that all of the slides and all of the charts have the CDC's logo on them. They look very official. They were the charts. Like,
yeah.
It was.
They just can't say it.
They just can't say it.
Gotcha.
But then the president did say it on Fox, essentially. So with that in mind, people started asking, hey, is this true? Are we going to have this many deaths? Are things not improving the way they seem to be improving? Because, again, we're opening states under the false guise, apparently, that things are improving. So the president and the White House say, and the CDC say, no, we don't know what's going on with all that. It's not real. Today they do know, and they're saying it is real. But I want to go back to the reality in which it wasn't real. That doesn't impact the reality that it is real. And I've mentioned it, I think I mentioned it in passing last week, but there's a lot of similarities between literally right now, and I've been reading a book about it, so I'm in tune to it more, but the 1968 election and everything that led into it. And the Vietnam War was a major part of it. The Vietnam War is pretty much the reason why Lyndon Johnson didn't run to be president in 1968. As a lot of people know, he announced that he wouldn't seek re-election, though he would have been the incumbent. Had Vietnam not happened, you could very much argue that Lyndon Johnson would have been president for another 4 years because of how great his civil policies were. He had created his ideal society. The economy was working for people on multiple fronts. It was working for nearly everybody, not everybody, because as we know, nothing is ever perfect, especially in the in the twilight years of the civil rights movement, or the early years of the civil rights movement. He had passed the Civil Rights Bill. He had passed the Voters' Rights Act that gave African Americans, the black folk, the right to vote. And he had been coming in on, again, a really strong economy. Then Vietnam happened, and then his administration started lying about Vietnam. They started saying things were working in Vietnam. They started to say that every time they sent more troops over, the results got better in Vietnam, exactly like what happened in Afghanistan. They did that, people caught wind of it, and his poll numbers just dropped sharply and plummeted to the bottom. And there's something interesting to that, because I believe that it should be happening now. There's a stark similarity between now and the Vietnam War, and that is that more Americans have died now than in the entire Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War lasted a while. This has only been 3 months, and they're saying by about 6 or so months in, essentially 6 or 7 months in. The calendar's not actually moving, so I don't know why I'm looking over there. But however long June is from now, they're expecting there to be nearly double the amount of lives lost in Vietnam from the coronavirus.
Wow.
Lyndon Johnson had the foresight to not run to be president. He announced he wouldn't run because he knew he couldn't fix the problems that he caused, and he was able to, one, recognize he wasn't going to win in 1968, so why put himself through that embarrassment? Why put the country through...
Why waste a ton of money?
Why waste a ton of money, and why put the country through all of that? So he chose not to run. And I believe the president should do that. And I believe the president should be being forced more to do that. I know it's not going to happen. I know that is a pipe dream of mine because our president we have now is nowhere near the person Lyndon Johnson was. For those of you that don't know Lyndon Johnson, despite his massive shortcomings and being a terrible president when it came to Vietnam War, is my favorite president. I love that he got so much done. I love that Whether he forced people to stay and work late hours, whether they stayed and worked late hours, they did it, and they did it for him. And they did it because they believed in what he stood for. And I love Lyndon Johnson for that. And I'm not going to stop loving Lyndon Johnson for that.
Can't stop this guy.
Can't stop me from loving Lyndon Johnson. So there's another similarity to the 1968 election year and right now. And that is that there were protests breaking out around the country, but for different reasons. There were the Watts riots, there were the Newark riots, Chicago riots, Houston riots, Los Angeles riots, riots breaking out all over the country in poor communities that were being bullied by police, that were being forced to have subprime housing because of housing laws depending where they lived, being forced into shitty living situations, poor economic conditions, despite the gains they'd had in technical equality and being that they could vote, they were not getting that via employers, they were not getting that from people in their communities. There was still huge backlash to civil rights in this country, and especially in a lot of these poorer communities where you had poor black families and poor white families who thought that they should be getting more, while these black families were starting to get more rights than they'd had before. There was a jealousy growing, and there was a fever pitch in a lot of countries in America around this. And I'm not saying we're on the heels of that now, but you had people protesting, you had people rioting in the streets. Not rioting, but they were being sold as riots. They turned into riots. And what you have right now are people protesting, having riots. They're not being called riots, and they're for a far less righteous situation. But I have a theory that brings these things together, and that is that the reason Lyndon Johnson took the hit to his polls that he took with Vietnam was because people on the Republican side of the aisle were waiting to catch him on something because they didn't like what he was giving to black people in this country. Every bit of backlash for the Vietnam War that Lyndon Johnson received was truly backlash, steeped. Granted, a lot of American lives were being lost. A lot of it was that people just didn't like what he was doing for black people in this country. So they took the Vietnam War and they said, you know what? Fuck it, let's tank his numbers, let's get him out of office. And it worked. There's a difference between Lyndon Johnson and Donald Trump, though. And that is that the people that got mad at Lyndon Johnson for what he did for black people in this country and for minorities in this country are the people who are now thrilled with what Donald Trump has done to blacks and minority people in this country. The outrage has switched sides, and that is why it is how it is now. And that is why it is so hypocritical, and that is why it is so craven, and why it is so callous, and what all of this is really about. If Donald Trump were half the man toward on just a civil rights scale and had done half of the good for a large group of people that weren't white in this country, it'd be a much different story. But since he is the president of the silent majority in this country, the disenfranchised white voter who feels that they have had everything taken from them by minorities and people coming in from goddamn Mexico and coming in from Liberia and coming in from goddamn Libya and Syria and anywhere else, because they keep coming and getting things, they feel like they are now the ones being persecuted again. So it just goes to show how coverage of a president and how coverage and belief in a person's morals changes how they get treated on a national stage. And it's the only reason Donald Trump has a fighting chance in November, is that there are people holding on to him and holding on to his lies and saying this isn't America's fault, this is the fault of somebody else. That's why you were seeing them. The internal polling came out this week. That leaked also this week about Trump's administration and showing that their real only chance to win in November at this point and to win on the coronavirus is to show that it is China's fault. They have to show that it is China's fault. They have to show that it came from a Chinese lab. They have to show that the Chinese lied to us. And I'm all for the Chinese having lied to us, because I full on believe that.
But wasn't it just proven that it wasn't China that brought it to America?
That is, and it is proven that China is not how it got here. It is proven that it came from European tourists coming from someplace in Europe. That's how it got to New York, at least. Or no, it came to Chicago, and that Chicago person came to
Well, they showed the amount of, like, European flights that came to Chicago and came to New York and came to Newark, and they said, like, they've been able to trace it. It was a European person that brought the first case.
Here. Regardless, there's proof that it didn't come from China.
Yeah, that ruins their whole argument.
And it ruins their whole argument. It's an argument they're going to try to make nonetheless because it's all they have. And my only argument, the only thing I have to say to the people, because again, the people that are choosing to be outraged by what we have to do for coronavirus, the only people that are pretending to be outraged by, or that maybe they're not pretending, but are unrightfully outraged for having to stay home because of these stay-home measures, is that the same intelligence community, and I know this doesn't speak very highly of the intelligence community because of what I'm relating it to, and I want us to trust in the U.S. intelligence system. I want that to be a thing that we do because we need to trust our institutions. That's a big thing that tyrants and wannabe tyrants do, is they make you doubt the institutions that you've been living under. Do not forget that the U.S. intelligence community, the same U.S. intelligence community that you allowed to inspire you to support the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, the same U.S. intelligence community that told you that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, are saying that this did not come from a Chinese lab. It came from China. That is unarguable. It started in the Wuhan province of China. We know that.
But didn't they say, sorry to interject,
no.
Didn't they say that it was in China in November and December, but the strain that we're having here came from Europe because it spread from China to Europe?
Yes. Exactly. But for the sake of them making the China argument, because you can make that argument to anybody you want. You can say that this came from Europe. They're not going to listen. A lot of that Trump base or a lot of swing voters, whenever originally the virus was called the Wuhan coronavirus, whenever people were talking about it coming from the Wuhan province. There is, in the way the message was relayed, we're already probably too far away, in my mind, to a place that we can get people to discern which country it came from the United States from. Mm-hmm. Even though we know, and Cuomo has told us, that it came here from a European tourist, you're not going to get that through to somebody who's standing out front of a state house with a gun.
Yeah, also, it doesn't matter where it came from. It's how you handle it.
Exactly.
And I know it's impossible to make that argument to them, too. But
And that's the next thing, is that no matter where it came from, no matter if it was a Chinese lab or from a bat or whatever, which is where the intelligence community is telling us it came from, where all the science is telling us it came from, none of that changes the sheer fact that it has been mismanaged by Trump and his administration every step of the way. Every step of the way. And it's funny because there was a story last week about Trump and the polling. We just talked about it. And he said that he was going to sue his campaign advisor because of the bad polling numbers that he was getting.
What?
Yeah.
Stupid.
He said he was going to... Brad Pascal, which I don't care if Brad Pascal gets sued. Fuck it, sue the guy. He's not exactly like a great dude or anything, but there is no one else to blame at this juncture for what Trump has done to this country via the coronavirus. The virus wasn't his fault, but everything afterward has been. Literally everything afterward has been. If we'd have shut down the country for 2 weeks at the start of this, we wouldn't be here today. There's evidence of that. There's people who have said that. Doctors and scientists have said there is data that shows that.
Well, just look at other countries as an example.
Exactly. If you look at the data from other countries.
They're playing baseball.
They're playing baseball in Korea, which is something we're very excited about here, is that we got to watch some baseball highlights today. And we're big Doosan Bear fans now all of a sudden here in this house because they're going to be having Korea League Baseball. It's the KOB. I don't know what the KOB stands for. Korean Organized Baseball, maybe? I don't know.
Regardless,
KBO.
They did a better job at handling this crisis, and now they get to play baseball.
Now they get things. There is no one else to blame but Trump for all of this. And that is what makes it the hardest for these people to understand it, is because, and this is, I think, the key here, these people have sunk so much of their reputation into this president already that any more knocks against his reputation at this point means that they themselves don't have a leg to stand on as being the good person, the good American that they think they are. And that is what the coronavirus is bringing to their attention. Because I don't know if you saw this story or not, but there's even there's a global summit happening right now where people are coming together and saying the global community is coming together. Countries from everywhere are saying, let's figure out this virus. Let's fund countries. Let's get research going to get a vaccine out quicker, a better vaccine out, and let's do it. You know who the only country not at those meetings is? It's the same country who had their Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, stand up in front of the world and say that it is communist China's fault that this got out. They're literally blaming the coronavirus on communism. Literally blaming it on a ruling principle instead of what it is, a huge government failure. And they're getting away with it to an extent, too, and it's their only chance.
Blaming other people will not change anything, though. You know, I feel like I would have been more understanding. I don't think it's ever the right thing to do, but let's say for, like, the first couple weeks of it being in the U.S., they wanted to blame China and put the blame on China. But now that we're, 3 months in, it's getting a little old because, like you said, they could be going to these summits. They could be working to fix it. Why waste all of your time just blaming other people? It's incredibly selfish, and it shows that that's the only argument, that's the only leg they have to stand on.
It's all they have. And now that...
Can you hear the beeping?
You probably can hear that beeping. I can't hear it on here because we're recording, but I can't. We're going to keep going. Let's power through.
Very distracting.
These are the same folks now whose mindset got them to turn up and vote against a Democratic Party that had moved the country forward so far from 1958 to a point where there was an honest-to-God chance for America to be the powerhouse that it is now. They voted against that and put Richard Nixon in because they were so upset of the advancements for other people. So I don't think these are people that we can reckon with at all. Johnson's numbers dropped. He realized he was the result of it, and that's the difference between what we have now, and I think that's why we technically survived as a nation, is because the person who was in charge knew he fucked it up, so he got out of there and let someone else finish the job for him.
Because he cared about the actual state and well-being of his country.
Because he actually cared about the state and well-being of the country, unlike the president we have now, who is just there to get another 4 years. That being said, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for tuning in to and another thing, we'll be back Friday with more of who knows what. If you're interested, we're putting up a bonus video on our YouTube channel. You can find us again on YouTube at and another thing, to search for us there. All about the importance of picking not only a good VP, it's the good VP. That's it, really. We'll talk all about that. It'll be up on YouTube later this evening, so please check us out there. Thank you again for hanging around. Have a great rest of your week.
Play ball.
Play ball.